for being a series sponsor this year of the Midwest Energy Policy Series. I am pleased to bring to you our next session. Our next two sessions will deal with electric vehicle charging infrastructure, but to kick it off, the premiere of Missouri's release of its white paper that reviewed Missouri's electric vehicle charging infrastructure, the status of it, gaps, who the stakeholders are. And the author of that, the one that did all the interviews and work, Travis Wood, our policy and program manager, has been with us for a number of years and is so modest failed to give me his own bio and to introduce him, so he didn't want me to do that. But he has worked over the last 3 months talking with you stakeholders on getting a better understanding of what resources are available and being utilized to grow our electric vehicle charging infrastructure and understanding what is to come. And before we talk with our panel, Travis is going to give the first presentation on this paper. So Travis, again, thank you for your hard work on this. Congratulations getting it done. And I'll hand it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Josh, for the introduction. And no one wants to hear my bio. I am excited to share the findings of this paper. Appreciate everybody sticking with us today. And as Josh said, we're releasing this paper today. So rest assured that you will be contacted several times to download the paper, but I'll show you how to do that at the end of my presentation here. And there'll also be a link to that shared with you following the event. As Josh mentioned, the development of this paper conducted a variety of stakeholder interviews with key players in the industry, did extensive research, and came up with this comprehensive overview of public EV infrastructure, charging infrastructure in the state. You know, like many states, Missouri has been working to balance and embrace the transition to electric vehicles. The industry is rapidly growing. And the question is, you know, does Missouri have the public charging infrastructure it needs to support this expanding market? Our hope is that this paper will support greater and more effective collaboration between partners, allowing for more efficient and cost-effective use of resources. So, you know, facilitating collaborations around thorny energy issues is really our bread and butter. And we're really hoping that this paper is the start of a conversation and those collaborations around this issue. So as we get into this, you know, let's take a look just nationally really quick. You know, if you were joining us yesterday, you heard from John Deal, Missouri Cobalt, talking about the EV industry and how that growth is impacting their business there and the growth of their business there. You know, depending on your source of information, we'll kind of tell you how fast this industry is growing, but despite the source, they all point to consistent growth over time. You know, EV market share is around 2% now, it's estimated to reach 10% by 2025, 28% by 2030, and 58% by 2040. So we can expect relatively explosive growth of the industry compared to what we've seen up to this point. Coupled with that growth is the need for charging infrastructure, and specifically public charging infrastructure. While it is the case that 80% of charging occurs in the home, at least currently, public charging infrastructure is needed to facilitate these longer trips, to top off during shorter trips, to reduce that range anxiety, and increase the visibility of EVs and help the industry grow. If we look nationally, the US has around 44,000 charging stations, but an estimated 1.25 million are going to be needed by 2030. So there's a lot of growth that's coming for this industry in a relatively short amount of time. If we look at Missouri specifically, and we start looking at the distribution of charging stations, you know, Missouri Department of Revenue numbers say there's around 9,000 registered light-duty all-electric vehicles as of the beginning of this year, January 1st, 2021. So there's obviously more now. If you look at DOE's infrastructure projection tool, they estimate that Missouri needs somewhere over 700 public charging ports to support that level of EV adoption. Missouri has over 2,000 public charging ports. 215 of those are fast chargers. The rest are level 2 that we're looking at there. And so according to that projection tool, Missouri has sufficient infrastructure given the current level of EV adoption. If you look at registered EVs compared to publicly available charging ports, Missouri ranks 9th in the country, but 33rd in terms of registered EV as a share of total registered vehicles. So there's a lot of room to grow for the EV industry and EV adoption in the state. And with that room to grow with EV adoption is the need for supporting public charging infrastructure. So looking at distribution again, these heat maps just kind of give you an idea of what you probably already know, which is, EV adoption, registered EVs, largely centered in the more urban areas of the state, Kansas City, St. Louis, Columbia, Springfield. The top 10 counties for EV registration as a share of total registered vehicles are in those areas. If you look at charging station port density, it largely parallels that EV adoption. Kansas City has the highest level of density for charging ports, public charging ports. And so you can kind of see that with the heat maps here, and the paper goes into this in some more detail as well. So if we look at deployment of charging station ports, again, I said it can be argued that Missouri has sufficient charging ports in place now to meet current EV adoption levels, but if we're looking up to 2030, it's estimated there's going to be over 200,000 EVs on the road in Missouri. So there's going to be the need for 8,000 plus public charging ports, at least according to DOE, to support that growing market. So there's a lot of room to grow. There's a lot of charging station ports that are going to need to be deployed in a relatively short amount of time. So what I want to do here next is what we do in the paper, taking a closer look, a little tour of Missouri, regional spotlights, using the same economic development regions that were discussed previously today when they talked about the state energy planning process, to look at what activities have been going on as far as charging station deployment is concerned in each of these economic development regions, and what distribution and penetration of EV charging looks like in these areas. So we're going to start our tour out in Kansas City. The KC region accounts for nearly 60% of all public charging stations in the state, only 23% of the registered EVs in the state. If you're looking at metropolitan areas comparing Kansas City and St. Louis, St. Louis has a much higher share of EV registrations in the state, but of course, as metro areas, they encompass more than just the Missouri portion of the city. So if you look at the Kansas side, there just tend to be higher EV registrations on that side. And in St. Louis, the situation is flipped. So you could say it's not a fair comparison just to look at the Missouri side. There's definitely wealth disparities on either side of the borders there that have a big factor on EV adoption. And that's something to be, aware of when you look at this data. If you look at Kansas City, it has a high density of level 2 charging stations. So 98% of the public charging stations in the Kansas City region are level 2 chargers. These are the 25 to 30 miles of range an hour versus the DC fast charging stations, where you're looking at a full charge in less than an hour, or 125 miles in 30 minutes. So the story of the development of Kansas City's EV industry is really, if you build it, they will come, and largely led by the utility Evergy, directly deploying charging stations. as part of their clean charge network. So Missouri is relatively unique, at least compared to the nation as a whole. 67% of the public charging ports in the state have been deployed by utilities, and largely Evergy has the lion's share of those, compared to 3% nationally, according to Edison Electric Institute. So the utilities have had a big role in the deployment of charging stations in the state. If you look at Evergy's future plans, largely up to this point, there's been direct deployment to spur the market. They, along with Liberty Utilities, who I'll touch on a little bit later, have proposed electrification transportation programs in front of the Missouri Public Service Commission, being reviewed and evaluated. And the portion of those that'll be approved will sort of determine the next steps. But proposed programming involves incentives to spur more private investment, some additional direct deployment, rate designs, etc. So there's definitely a lot of programming that's going to take place from the utility side going into the near future here. I did want to touch on, in Kansas City too, there's a pilot project led by the Metropolitan Energy Center through a DOE grant. NREL, Evergy, S&T are all partners, focused on installing charging infrastructure on streetlights to enhance equitable access to charging in areas that don't currently have access. So that'll be an interesting pilot project to keep an eye on going forward. I'll try to speed along here on our tour a little bit. As Josh mentioned, we do have an expert panel following this, so we can kind of get a boots on the ground human side to the experience that some experts are having in these areas. If we look at St. Louis, just like Kansas City, the public utility has had a big impact. So Ameren, Missouri, as opposed to Evergy, they are not directly deploying charging stations, but are utilizing incentive programs to spur private investment in charging stations. So through their Charge Ahead program, $11 million program, it's focused on DC fast charging stations and highway corridors, as well as level 2 and DC fast charging stations at workplaces, multifamily dwellings, and publicly accessible locations. If we look at the city of St. Louis, they've passed EV-ready ordinances that mandate either EV readiness or installation of charging stations for new construction and retrofit projects. Those begin to go into effect next year, I believe, and into 2025 when they'll be completely phased in. Also in St. Louis, Richmond Heights has passed EV-ready ordinances. The St. Louis County recently passed EV codes as well. And where I'm located, suburb of St. Louis here in Brentwood, I know that they were supposed to vote on that earlier this week, and I look forward to finding out exactly what happened. And maybe there's one of the expert panelists can answer that question for me, but there's definitely a lot of movement happening in the ordinance side of things that will kind of help spur the industry forward. Another pilot project that is also focused on equity in St. Louis, the Silvers Project, St. Louis Vehicle Electrification Rides for Seniors. This aims to reduce transportation costs for social service agencies, and there's going to be some interesting reporting out of that, I think, too, in the future. If we look at the Southwest region, accounts for approximately 11% of the charging station ports statewide, 8% of EV registrations, clustered largely in Branson, Joplin, and Springfield. Liberty Utilities, formerly Empire District Electric Company, has also directly installed charging stations as Empire and part of their Evolve program prior to Liberty's acquisition. They have proposed programming in front of the Missouri PSC, and I believe earlier this week an agreement might have been reached there, so there might be some more clarity in what's going to be moving forward. This is all laid out in detail in the paper, but incentive programs, direct deployment, charging stations for school buses, etc. So there's a lot of interesting proposed programming that may or may not be implemented now, but maybe in the future as well. I do want to note, and it's talked in more detail in the paper, but the VW settlement process has also resulted in some DC fast charging stations along highway corridors. And there's 2 of those locations in the southwest region here. And the municipal utility in the area, City Utilities, has a residential EV ready rebate for outlets to facilitate level 2 charging. So a lot going on in this region as well. If we head on over to the central region, accounts for an oversized portion of the DC fast charging in the state, 21%. I think this owes to the geographic location here, major highway corridors sort of crisscrossing the state here, and attracting investment from Tesla, as well as utilities and VW settlement funding in the region. I also wanted to note when we were talking about this region that in Rolla, Missouri, S&T has a lot of really interesting research going on when it comes to EV charging. They have an ultra fast EV charging project funded through DOE, trying to get charging down to DC fast charging down to more 10 minutes instead of half an hour. So a lot of interesting work on the use of energy storage to mitigate impacts on the grid and things like that. If we head up to the northern region, 17% of the state's DC fast charging stations are here. Overall, only 8% of the state's public charging ports. There's VW settlement funding stations, 3 of them here. Also, a portion of this is in Evergy service territory, so there's some of their stations here as well. One thing I wanted to note in the northern region is that the first electric school bus in Missouri has been put into service there, Knox County R1 School District. It linked to in the paper, but they have a really interesting project where they're comparing the school bus to their diesel buses as well, and looking at total cost of ownership, maintenance impacts for the students with health and safety and comfort, etc. Public website, they're sharing their data publicly, and kind of an interesting project for the students as well as the school district. So that's something to keep an eye on going forward. And they did utilize funding from VW Settlement Trust as well as their local electric cooperatives. So if we look at the southeast region, this is the lowest density of charging stations in the state and lowest EV ownership as well. Despite the lack of current charging infrastructure in this region, there are efforts to prepare for more EVs on the road in the future. So the Southeast Metropolitan Planning Organization has contracted with a consultant recently to develop an EV readiness plan. And the idea is to attract tourism dollars through and economic development incentives, and become better positioned to take advantage of grant dollars that might be coming nationally, and just to prepare and determine what their community needs are in terms of charging infrastructure. So there's some interesting developments there. So that's it for our tour. Again, a lot more detail in the paper. What I wanted to end on here is what we end on in the paper, and that is through the stakeholder interviews that we conducted, identified some deployment obstacles and deployment gaps that will need to be addressed as Missouri moves forward with the transition to a more electrified future for transportation. Main obstacles highlighted by stakeholders were high upfront costs of charging stations, especially DC fast charging stations, return on investment issues, and related to that, EV adoption issues, and lack of statewide coordination. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I think our expert panel is going to have an interesting discussion on several of these topics, but wanted to bring those up. And then deployment gaps. These are not only associated with Missouri. These are issues that are being faced nationally, but rural areas, multifamily dwellings, there are issues with attracting investment, as well as complexity and issues that need to be figured out to fill these gaps. But I think it's safe to say that at least at this point, being intentional about filling these gaps is part of solving that problem. So what our paper does is focuses on those areas and touches on what programs and policies are happening here in Missouri and elsewhere to kind of fill these gaps. So that's what I've got for you with our paper. You can download the paper at our website, moenergy.org. It's right there on the homepage, real easy for you. You can email me, travis@moenergy.org, and be sure that you'll probably be hearing about it more than you want to, because we want to make sure that this is starting a conversation. Everyone gets the opportunity to kind of check out this information and collaborate on this issue moving forward. So I'm excited to introduce our next and final session of the day and of our event. We have an expert panel focused on EV infrastructure here in Missouri. So I can tell you that these fine folks were nice enough to sit down with me and have some conversations virtually about the policies and programs and their experience in this area to help the development of this paper. And so I think this is going to be a really fascinating